Dust choked the unforgiving streets of Bitter Creek. But it wasn't the dirt that killed you. It was the cruelty. When a rugged mountain man caught a starving widow and her shivering children fighting stray dogs for rotting scraps, he didn't offer pity. He offered a loaded revolver and an escape. The biting November wind howling off the Bighorn Mountains carried the stench of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and utter desperation. Bitter Creek was a town born of greed and sustained by vice, a place where morality went to die. In the frozen Wyoming mud, in the narrow, trash-littered alleyway behind Hatcher's Provisions, the harsh reality of the frontier was playing out in its most heartbreaking form. Abigail Miller knelt in the freezing slush, her once fine cotton dress now a collection of filthy, threadbare rags clinging to her thinning frame. Beside her, 7-year-old Toby and 4-year-old Maggie huddled together, their small faces smeared with dirt and tear tracks. The brutal winter was setting in, and it had been 3 months since Abigail's husband, Arthur, had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine, a supposed accident that had conveniently left Abigail penniless and indebted to the town's most ruthless proprietor, Jebediah Hatcher. Her frost-bitten fingers desperately clawed at the frozen earth, unearthing a half-rotted potato and a few discarded apple cores from a wooden slop bucket. A feral, mangy dog growled from the shadows, edging closer to the meager prize. Abigail, driven by the primal instinct of a starving mother, grabbed a broken piece of a wooden crate and swung it wildly at the beast. "Get away!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and broken. "Leave us be!" The dog snapped its jaws, but retreated a few paces, waiting. Abigail quickly wiped the grime from the potato on her skirt and handed it to Toby. "Here, sweetheart, eat it slow, give a bite to your sister." Her dignity had died weeks ago. She was a woman who had once played the piano in a parlor back in Street Louis. Now, she was reduced to scavenging like a rat to keep her children breathing. She closed her eyes, letting out a ragged sob that she quickly stifled. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched against the icy gravel at the mouth of the alley. Abigail flinched, instinctively pulling Toby and Maggie behind her. Most men in Bitter Creek looked at a destitute widow with either cruel indifference or predatory intent. The man standing at the edge of the alley possessed neither. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and carved from the very granite of the mountains that loomed above the town. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat that made him look half-beast, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and the wide brim of a weathered Stetson. A massive Sharps buffalo rifle was slung effortlessly over his shoulder, and a Colt revolver rested comfortably at his hip. His pale blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, took in the scene. The shivering woman, the starving children, the rotting scraps. Gideon Hayes had spent the last decade walking the high, lonely timberlines, trading pelts and seeking a quiet solitude away from the rot of civilized men. He had only come down to Bitter Creek to purchase black powder and salt. He hated this town. He hated what men did to each other when gold and greed clouded their minds. Before Gideon could speak, the back door of the mercantile swung open violently. A stout, red-faced clerk stepped out, holding a bucket of dirty, freezing scrub water. "I told you to clear out, you begging trash." The clerk spat, raising the bucket to douse Abigail and her children. "Mister," Hatcher said, "if you ain't got coin to pay your husband's debts, you can freeze in the street." Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms around her children to shield them from the icy water. The splash never came. A sound like a cracking whip echoed in the narrow space. The clerk screamed, dropping the bucket as a heavy, lead ball shattered the wooden doorframe just an inch from his ear. The dirty water splashed harmlessly onto the frozen ground. Gideon slowly lowered his smoking Colt, his expression utterly unchanged. "Man shouldn't waste water," Gideon rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Abigail's chest. "And a man certainly shouldn't raise a hand to a woman and her kin." The clerk, pale and trembling, scrambled backward into the store, slamming the heavy wooden door shut. and throwing the deadbolt. Gideon holstered his weapon with a practiced, fluid motion. He walked slowly down the alley, his heavy boots crushing the frozen mud. The feral dog took one look at the massive mountain man and bolted into the shadows. Gideon stopped a few feet from Abigail. He reached into his deep canvas satchel and pulled out a heavy parcel wrapped in oiled paper. He tossed it gently into the snow at Abigail's knees. "Salted venison and hardtack," Gideon said softly. "It ain't a feast, but it'll put fire in their bellies." Abigail stared at the package, then up at the giant of a man. Her pride warred with her desperation. But the sound of Maggie's stomach growling made the choice for her. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the meat, tearing off small, tender pieces for the children before taking a tiny bite herself. The rich, salty flavor brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Why?" Abigail whispered, looking up at him. "Nobody in this town does anything without a price. What do you want?" Gideon looked at her. Beneath the dirt, the hollow cheeks, and the exhaustion, he saw a fierce, unbroken spirit. He saw a woman fighting a war against an entire world just to keep her bloodline alive. "I've seen wolves treat their sick better than the folks in this town treat you," Gideon said, his jaw tightening. He looked toward the snow-capped peaks looming in the distance. "Winter is closing its grip. You stay in this alley. The cold will take your little ones by the end of the week. If the cold doesn't, Hatcher's men will." He extended a massive, calloused hand toward her. "Come with me. You deserve better," the mountain man said. "I have a cabin up near the timberline at Whispering Pines. It's warm. There's food. It ain't an easy life, but it's an honest one. And no man will ever raise his voice to you or these children again while I draw breath." Abigail stared at his outstretched hand. To go into the wild mountains with a total stranger was madness. But looking back at the locked door of the mercantile and the cruel town that had murdered her husband and left her to rot, she realized the true madness was staying. She placed her small, freezing hand into his massive, warm one. "I am Abigail. Abigail Miller. And if you save my children, I will work my fingers to the bone to repay you." "You don't owe me a damn thing, Abigail Miller," Gideon replied, pulling her effortlessly to her feet. "Now, wrap those kids in whatever you have. We ride before the sun sets." They left Bitter Creek under the shadow of dusk, just as the first heavy flakes of a severe winter squall began to fall. Gideon had secured Abigail and the children onto the back of his sturdy pack mule, swathing them in thick wool blankets and heavy bear hides he had purchased with his remaining trapping coin. Gideon himself walked ahead, leading his massive grey-roan stallion by the reins, breaking a trail through the deepening snow. For the first few miles, Abigail sat in a state of numb disbelief. The rocking motion of the mule, the profound silence of the falling snow, and the steady, rhythmic crunch of Gideon's boots were a stark contrast to the chaotic misery of the town. Maggie had already fallen asleep, her face buried in the warm fur of a pelt. Toby sat rigid, his wide eyes scanning the dark, imposing trunks of the lodgepole pines. Abigail couldn't take her eyes off Gideon's broad back. He moved through the treacherous terrain with a quiet grace, a man entirely in his element. He didn't speak much, only pausing occasionally to check the mule's footing or to hand Abigail a canteen of water. Despite the terrifying vastness of the wilderness swallowing them whole, for the first time in months, Abigail felt a strange, terrifying spark of safety. But down in the valley, that safety was already unraveling. Inside the smoky, dim confines of Hatcher's saloon, Jebediah Hatcher slammed his fist onto a heavy oak desk. He was a wealthy, bloated man with cold, calculating eyes. Standing before him was Deacon Cobb, a tall, gaunt enforcer known for his skill with a tracking knife and his total lack of a conscience. "What do you mean she's gone?" Hatcher snarled, spit flying from his lips. "She's a starving widow with 2 brats. Where could she possibly go in a blizzard?" The clerk said. A mountain man pulled a gun on him. Deacon Cobb drawled, picking dirt from under his fingernails with a bone-handled hunting knife. "Big fellow, fits the description of that trapper, Hayes. They were seen heading up the North Pass toward the timberline. Hatcher's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You ignorant fool. You think I was keeping her around out of the goodness of my heart? Arthur Miller didn't die owing me gambling debts. He died because he struck a vein of pure quartz gold up near the Whispering Pines. And he refused to tell my boys exactly where it was before they beat him too hard." Cobb stopped picking at his nails, his dark eyes narrowing. "You think the widow knows where the claim is? She has his journal? Or the map? Or maybe she just heard him babbling about landmarks in his sleep?" Hatcher hissed. Arthur Miller was a paranoid fool. If he hid a map, he hid it on those children or with his wife. If Hayes takes them deep into the mountains, we lose that vein forever. And if Hayes finds out about it, he'll claim it himself. Hatcher pulled a heavy canvas bag of gold eagles from his desk drawer and tossed it to Cobb. "Take 3 men. I don't care about the storm. Track them down. Kill the mountain man. Bring the woman and the brats back alive. Do not fail me, Deacon." High up on the mountain trail, oblivious to the hounds that had just been unleashed on their scent, Gideon called for a halt. The wind was picking up, howling furiously through the canyons and whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. They had reached a natural rock overhang that offered shelter from the biting gale. Gideon expertly built a smokeless fire using dried sage and deadwood from deep within a thicket, shielding the flames with a semicircle of rocks. The heat radiating off the stone wall was immediate and glorious. He lifted Toby and Maggie down from the mule, sitting them near the warmth, then turned to help Abigail. As her boots hit the icy ground, her frozen legs gave out. She pitched forward, but Gideon caught her instantly, his strong arms wrapped around her waist, holding her steady against his broad chest. For a fleeting second, Abigail was acutely aware of his masculine scent wood smoke, pine needles, and leather. She looked up, her breath catching as her eyes met his. Up close, beneath the rugged exterior, she saw a profound, guarded sorrow in his pale eyes. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice softer than the howling wind. "You're safe now, Abigail." "Thank you," she breathed, hastily stepping back, her cheeks burning from more than just the cold. She moved to the fire, taking her children into her lap. Gideon handed her a tin cup of boiling black coffee, heavily sweetened with molasses. "Drink. It'll chase the chill from your blood. We'll rest here for a few hours. The pass ahead is too treacherous to navigate blind in the dark." Abigail sipped the scalding, sweet liquid, feeling life slowly seep back into her limbs. "Gideon," she asked softly, looking at the flames, "why do you live up here? All alone?" Gideon sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked into the fire for a long time before answering. "Civilization is a disease, Abigail. Men build towns to feel safe, but all they do is bring their greed, their lies, and their violence closer together. I lost a life, once, to the greed of men in a town much like Bitter Creek. I swore I'd never let that poison touch me again." He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. "But seeing you and your little ones today, it reminded me that sometimes you can't just turn your back on the world. Sometimes you have to stand between the innocent and the wolves." A heavy, poignant silence settled over the camp, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. For the first time since Arthur died, Abigail felt the icy barricade around her heart begin to thaw. This rugged, dangerous man had shown her more tenderness in a few hours than she had known in years. Suddenly, Gideon's head snapped up. His pale eyes widened, staring out into the blinding white darkness of the trail they had just climbed. Abigail froze. "Gideon? What is it?" He didn't answer. In one fluid motion, he snatched his heavy Sharps rifle from the rocks, his thumb pulling back the hammer with a loud, ominous click. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the alcove into pitch blackness. "Stay low," Gideon whispered, his voice deadly serious as he moved to the edge of the rocks, blending into the shadows, "and keep the children quiet." Over the howling wind, Abigail finally heard it. The distinct, unmistakable crunch of horseshoes on icy rock, and the muffled curse of a man making his way up the pass. They were not alone in the mountains. The silence of the mountain was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the unmistakable metallic scrape of a spur against granite. Gideon Hayes did not breathe. He simply let his body become one with the freezing shadows of the rock face. Below him, the trail was a treacherous ribbon of ice winding through the jagged teeth of the Bighorn Mountains. Completely obscured by the driving snow, 3 shadows detached themselves from the swirling whiteout. They were leading their horses, the beasts snorting and tossing their heads, clearly spooked by the sheer drop to their left and the blinding storm. "I'm telling you, Deacon, they ain't up here." A voice whined over the gale. It belonged to a stout, miserable-looking thug named Bozeman. His beard caked in ice. No man takes a woman and 2 brats into a whiteout. They probably holed up in an abandoned mine shaft lower down. "Shut your mouth, Bozeman, and keep your eyes on the snow," Deacon Cobb hissed, his gaunt face wrapped tightly in a wool scarf. "Hayes is a mountain man. He won't stop until he reaches his cabin. Hatcher wants them, and Hatcher gets what he wants." Spread out, from his vantage point 20 yards above, Gideon thumbed the heavy hammer of his Sharps buffalo rifle. He had no illusions about these men. They were not lawmen. They were Hatcher's paid killers, wolves in men's clothing. If they found the alcove, Abigail and the children would be shown no mercy. Gideon leveled the heavy octagonal barrel, resting it on a snow-covered boulder. He aimed not for the men, but for the slab of loose, ice-wedged shale directly above them. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared, a deafening explosion of black powder that momentarily illuminated the canyon in a flash of hellish orange. The massive, 5.0 caliber slug struck the shale with the force of a cannonball. The rock shattered, instantly triggering a localized avalanche of ice, snow, and razor-sharp stone. Bozeman screamed as a chunk of granite, the size of an anvil, caught his horse on the flank. The animal reared, panicked, and plunged backward over the edge of the trail, taking Bozeman with it into the black abyss below. The scream faded rapidly, swallowed by the howling wind. "Ambush!" yelled the third man, a young, nervous kid named Cleet, wildly drawing his revolver and firing blindly into the storm. Deacon Cobb didn't panic. He dropped to one knee, his eyes tracking the muzzle flash. He raised his Winchester repeater and fired 3 rapid shots at Gideon's position. Gideon ducked, the hot lead chipping the rock just inches from his face, spraying his cheek with stone fragments. He smoothly breached the Sharps, extracting the smoking brass cartridge, and shoved another one home. But Cobb was already moving, using the blinding snow as cover, bounding from rock to rock with the deadly grace of a seasoned predator. "Stay here," Gideon whispered to the wind. He left the heavy rifle on the ledge and drew his Colt revolver, sliding down the icy embankment to flank the remaining trackers. The snow was falling so thick now that visibility was reduced to mere feet. Gideon moved by instinct, his leather boots making no sound on the fresh powder. He heard the nervous, ragged breathing of Cleet just ahead. The boy was backed against the canyon wall, his gun shaking in his hand. "Drop it, boy," Gideon rumbled from the whiteout, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. Cleet spun around, firing blindly. The bullet went wide. Gideon stepped out of the swirling snow, grabbed the boy's wrist, and twisted brutally. The revolver clattered to the ice. With a swift, calculated strike from the butt of his Colt, Gideon knocked Cleet unconscious. He had no desire to kill a greenhorn who was merely following orders. But Deacon Cobb was a different breed. A sharp crack echoed, and searing pain ripped across Gideon's left side. He stumbled, falling hard against a snow-draped pine. Cobb had flanked him. "Not so tough without the high ground, are you, Hayes?" Cobb's voice drifted through the storm, cold and mocking. "Hatcher sends his regards. Hand over the widow and the brats." and maybe I let you bleed out in peace." Gideon clamped a massive hand over his ribcage. He felt the hot, sticky slick of his own blood soaking through his wool shirt and buffalo coat. The bullet had grazed his ribs, a shallow but violently painful wound. "You'll have to come and get them, Deacon," Gideon grunted, fighting through the wave of dizziness. Cobb fired again, the bullet tearing through the bark of the pine tree inches from Gideon's head. Gideon dropped to his stomach, aiming low through the snowdrifts. He saw the dark outline of Cobb's boots. Gideon fired twice. Cobb cursed loudly as one of the .45 caliber slugs shattered his ankle. He went down hard, dropping his rifle. Knowing the fight was turning against him, Cobb dragged himself backward toward the edge of the trail, slipping into the heavy brush. "This ain't over, Hayes," Cobb screamed, his voice laced with agony and raw hatred. "Hatcher knows about the gold. He'll send an army." Gideon pushed himself up, his revolver aimed into the brush, but Cobb was gone, swallowed by the blizzard and the dark. The mountain man leaned against the tree, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked down at his blood-soaked hand. The cold was already setting in, numbing the searing pain, which he knew was a dangerous sign. He had to get them to the cabin now. When he returned to the alcove, Abigail was standing at the entrance, clutching a heavy piece of firewood like a club, her eyes wide with terror. Toby and Maggie were huddled behind her, terrified but silent. When she saw Gideon emerge from the shadows, her breath hitched. She dropped the wood and rushed forward, her eyes darting to the blood coating his left side. "Gideon! You're shot!" she gasped, reaching out but afraid to touch the wound. "It's just a graze," Gideon lied, his voice tight. He walked over to his roan stallion, grateful the well-trained animal hadn't bolted. He hoisted Toby and Maggie into the saddle. "We can't stay here. The one that got away. He knows we're heading up. We have to push for the timberline." Abigail looked at the blood dripping onto the snow. "You're bleeding badly. You can't lead the horse like this." "I have to," Gideon said, turning his pale, intense eyes toward her. "If I stop moving, I won't start again. Help me get you on the horse." Abigail shook her head. "No. The horse carries the children and the supplies. I will walk. You lean on me." Gideon looked at this frail, battered woman, a woman who had been starving in an alley just hours ago. The fierce, unyielding strength in her eyes left him speechless. Without a word, he draped his heavy good arm over her shoulders. Together, leaning on each other, they stepped out into the teeth of the blizzard, beginning the grueling final ascent to Whispering Pines. It took 3 agonizing hours to conquer the final 2 miles. By the time the dark, heavy timbers of Gideon's cabin emerged from the blinding whiteout, Abigail was operating on pure, blind adrenaline. Her legs were numb stumps of ice, and Gideon's weight upon her shoulders had grown terrifyingly heavy. "We're here," Gideon whispered, his voice dangerously slurred. "We made it." He stumbled forward, almost taking Abigail down with him, and shoved open the heavy oak door. They spilled into the pitch-black interior, bringing a flurry of snow with them. Gideon managed to strike a lucifer match, lighting a kerosene lantern on a heavy wooden table before collapsing onto a nearby cot, his chest heaving. Abigail didn't have time to collapse. She had to act. The cabin was a fortress against the elements, sturdy, well-insulated, and smelling of dried herbs, cured leather, and wood smoke. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. Abigail rushed to it, finding a pile of dry kindling and split logs ready to go. With trembling, frost-bitten fingers, she managed to light the fire. Within minutes, a glorious, life-saving heat began to push back the freezing dark. She quickly brought Toby and Maggie inside, stripping them of their wet outer layers and wrapping them in the thick, dry furs piled on a rug near the hearth. Once she was certain the children were warming up and safe, she turned her attention to the giant of a man bleeding out on the cot. "Gideon," she said softly, rushing to his side. He was pale, his eyes half closed. "Knapsack by the door." bandages,